In the journey of faith, trusting in God's perfect timing is essential. The Bible teaches us that divine timing, though often mysterious, aligns with God's ultimate plan for our lives, leading to profound blessings. 1. New opportunities and blessings. Trusting God for new opportunities and blessings. In the journey of life, there are moments when we find ourselves standing at the threshold of change. These moments, while filled with anticipation, can also bring uncertainty and doubt. However, the Bible assures us that God is always working behind the scenes, preparing us for new opportunities and blessings that will transform our lives. One of the most comforting promises in Scripture is found in Jeremiah 29:11, where God declares, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." This passage reminds us that God's plans for us are filled with goodness and hope, even when we cannot see or understand what is unfolding. It is essential to trust that God is at work, even during periods of waiting and uncertainty. Just as the gardener patiently tends to a growing tree, knowing that in time it will bear fruit, we must also trust in God's timing and preparation. Consider the story of Joseph in the Old Testament. Joseph, the favored son of Jacob, experienced a series of trials that seemed to contradict God's promise of blessing. Sold into slavery by his brothers, imprisoned on false charges, and forgotten by those he helped, Joseph's journey was fraught with challenges. Yet throughout his trials, Joseph remained faithful to God. His perseverance and trust were rewarded when he was eventually elevated to a position of great authority in Egypt. This promotion was not merely a personal triumph, but a divine setup to save many lives during a time of famine. Joseph's story illustrates that while God's plans may involve periods of testing and waiting, they are ultimately designed to bring about significant blessings and fulfill His promises. The process of waiting for God's timing can be likened to the process of waiting for a seed to grow. Just as a seed requires time, nourishment, and care to grow into a fruitful plant, our lives require patience and faith. Each moment of waiting is part of God's divine preparation. He is equipping us, strengthening our character, and positioning us for the blessings He has in store. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul provides another example of faith in action. In 2 Corinthians 12-9, Paul writes, "But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness.'" Paul experienced suffering and hardship, yet he trusted in God's grace and power. His faith through these trials allowed him to see how God's strength was revealed in his weaknesses, ultimately leading to greater spiritual growth and blessings. The essence of trusting God for new opportunities and blessings lies in acknowledging that our understanding is limited compared to God's infinite wisdom. We may not see the full picture or understand why we face certain challenges, but we can be assured that God's plans are always for our good. When we trust Him with our lives, we open ourselves to receive the transformative blessings He has prepared. Trusting God to open new doors and bring blessings involves patience, faith, and a deep conviction that His plans are always for our benefit. Just as Joseph's trials led to his exaltation, and Paul's weaknesses highlighted God's power, our own periods of waiting are part of a divine process leading to profound changes. Jeremiah 29:11 encourages us to trust in God's promise of a hopeful future. As we remain steadfast in our faith, we can be confident that God is preparing us for a victory that will far exceed our expectations, transforming our lives in ways we could never have imagined. 2. Jeremiah 29:11. In our fast-paced world, patience is often tested, and waiting can be challenging. However, the Bible repeatedly emphasizes the importance of trusting in God's timing. even when his plans are not immediately apparent. Jeremiah 29:11 offers profound reassurance, declaring, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." This promise encourages us to trust that God is always at work, even in times of silence and waiting. One powerful illustration of this principle is found in the life of Abraham, who is considered the father of faith. God promised Abraham that he would become the father of many nations, yet he and his wife Sarah faced the challenge of infertility. Despite their advanced age, Abraham remained faithful to God's promise, demonstrating incredible patience. In Genesis 15:5-6, God reassures Abraham, saying, "Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. So shall your offspring be." Abraham's faith was credited to him as righteousness, and at the appointed time, God fulfilled his promise by blessing Abraham and Sarah with a son, Isaac. This story underscores the truth that God's timing is perfect, even when our circumstances seem impossible. Another compelling example is the story of David, who was anointed as king by the prophet Samuel while he was still a shepherd boy. Despite this divine anointing, David faced years of hardship, including being pursued by King Saul, who sought to kill him. David had to wait patiently for God to fulfill his promise of kingship. Throughout his trials, David maintained his faith and trust in God. In Psalm 27:14, David writes, "Wait for the Lord. Be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord." Eventually, God's timing brought David to the throne, and he became a king who would lead Israel with faithfulness and integrity. These biblical narratives illustrate that waiting on God is not a passive experience, but an active process of trust and faith. Just as a seed must be nurtured and given time to grow before it bears fruit, our faith is strengthened and our character is refined through periods of waiting. This waiting is part of God's divine preparation, equipping us to handle the blessings He has in store. The Apostle Paul also provides insight into the nature of waiting and patience in his letters. In Romans 8:28, he writes, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." This verse reassures us that God is working in every situation, even when we cannot see immediate results. Paul himself experienced numerous trials and delays in his ministry, yet he continued to trust in God's plan. His perseverance and faith led to the spread of the gospel and the establishment of early Christian communities. Trusting God's timing requires us to surrender our own plans and desires to His perfect will. It involves believing that He knows what is best for us, and that He is orchestrating every detail of our lives for our good and His glory. As we wait, we are called to cultivate patience, strengthen our faith, and remain steadfast in prayer. Please comment number 1 so God can help you have a wonderful day. 3. Faith and patience. The faithful journey trusting in God's process. Life's journey often includes periods of waiting and uncertainty, where it can be challenging to see how our struggles and patience are leading to greater blessings. Yet the Bible consistently teaches us that God's process is purposeful and ultimately for our good. In Jeremiah 29:11, God assures us, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." This promise is a reminder that even in times of waiting, God is working behind the scenes to bring about His perfect plan. Consider the story of Joseph, a prominent figure in the Old Testament whose life vividly illustrates the concept of divine preparation through waiting. Joseph was the favored son of Jacob, but his life took a dramatic turn when his brothers sold him into slavery out of jealousy. Despite his unjust suffering, Joseph remained faithful and worked diligently in Potiphar's house. He faced false accusations and imprisonment, yet he continued to trust God. During his time in prison, Joseph interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker, which eventually led to his own interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams. His accurate interpretation led to his promotion as the second most powerful man in Egypt, where he was able to save many lives during a famine. Joseph's story highlights that God uses our periods of waiting and hardship to prepare us for greater purposes. His faithfulness through trials and patience led to the fulfillment of God's promise and a blessing that far exceeded his expectations. Another example is the life of David, who was anointed as king by the prophet Samuel while he was still a young shepherd. Despite this anointing, David spent years fleeing from King Saul, who sought to kill him out of jealousy. During this time, David faced numerous challenges and was in constant danger. Despite these difficulties, David trusted in God's promise and continued to lead with integrity. His experiences, including his time in hiding and his leadership in difficult circumstances, were all part of God's preparation process. When David finally became king, he was better equipped to lead Israel with wisdom and strength. His journey underscores the truth that God's process of preparation through trials is designed to shape and refine us for the roles and blessings He has in store. The Apostle Paul's life also reflects this principle. In 2 Corinthians 12-9, Paul writes, "But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness.'" Paul experienced significant suffering, including physical ailments and persecution. Yet he trusted in God's grace and saw his weaknesses as opportunities for God's power to be displayed. Through his perseverance and faith, Paul's ministry greatly impacted the early Christian church, spreading the message of the gospel far and wide. His experiences reveal that God's process of preparing us often involves challenges that teach us to rely on His grace and strength. These biblical stories teach us that periods of waiting and difficulty are not meaningless, but are part of God's divine preparation for greater blessings. Just as Joseph's, David's, and Paul's journeys involved trials that ultimately led to greater fulfillment of God's promises, our own experiences of waiting and patience serve a purpose. God uses these times to refine our character, build our faith, and prepare us for the blessings He has planned. 5. Moses' persistence. Navigating through life's uncertainties and challenges often requires unwavering trust in God's guidance. The Bible frequently reminds us that despite our struggles, God's hand is continually at work, guiding us toward His ultimate plan. Romans 8:28 reassures us, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." This verse highlights that God's guidance is active and purposeful, even when our path seems unclear. A profound example of trusting God's guidance is found in the story of Abraham. Abraham was called by God to leave his homeland and journey to an unknown land that God promised to give him. Despite not knowing the exact destination or the trials he would face, Abraham obeyed. Hebrews 11:8 states, "By faith Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going." Abraham's faith and obedience demonstrated his trust in God's guidance, which ultimately led him to the land of Canaan and the fulfillment of God's promises. His journey illustrates that trusting in God's guidance requires faith and obedience, even when the path is not clearly visible. Another significant example is the story of the Israelites' exodus from Egypt. After being freed from slavery, the Israelites wandered in the desert for 40 years before reaching the Promised Land. During this time, God guided them with a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Exodus 13:21 says, "By day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light." Despite their complaints and doubts, God's guidance was constant, leading them through the wilderness to their promised destination. The Israelites' journey teaches us that even in periods of uncertainty and difficulty, God's guidance is steadfast and reliable, leading us toward His promised blessings. The life of King David further exemplifies trusting in God's guidance. After being anointed as king, David faced numerous challenges, including being pursued by King Saul and leading a nation through turbulent times. Despite these difficulties, David sought God's guidance in all his decisions. In Psalm 25:4-5, David prays, "Show me your ways, Lord. Teach me your paths. Guide me in your truth and teach me, for you are God my Savior, and my hope is in you all day long." David's reliance on God's guidance and his prayers for direction exemplify the importance of seeking God's will in every aspect of life. His faithfulness and trust in God's guidance led to his eventual success as a king and a man after God's own heart. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul's life also demonstrates trust in God's guidance. Paul faced numerous trials, including imprisonment and shipwrecks, as he traveled to spread the gospel. Despite these hardships, Paul remained confident in God's guidance. In Acts 27:23-24, Paul tells the people on the ship, "Last night an angel of the God, whose I am, and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you.'" Paul's unwavering trust in God's guidance during these trials showcases his faith that God was directing his path, even in the face of adversity. 6. Isaiah 40:31. Understanding and trusting in God's timing is essential for a faithful journey through life. The Bible teaches that God's timing is perfect and purposeful, even when it seems delayed or uncertain. Ecclesiastes 3:1 declares, "To everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven." This verse reminds us that God has a divine schedule for all events in our lives, and His timing is always aligned with His greater plan. One powerful example of trusting in God's timing is found in the story of Hannah in 1 Samuel. Hannah was deeply distressed because she was unable to have children, while her rival, Peninnah, had many. Despite her anguish, Hannah prayed earnestly to God, asking for a child. In 1 Samuel 1:20, it is recorded, "So in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, 'Because I asked the Lord for him.'" God answered Hannah's prayers in His perfect timing, and Samuel became a significant prophet in Israel. Hannah's story illustrates that even when answers to our prayers seem delayed, God's timing is always precise and purposeful, bringing about His plans in the right moment. The life of Joseph, as detailed in Genesis, further underscores the importance of trusting God's timing. After being sold into slavery by his brothers and wrongfully imprisoned, Joseph endured years of hardship. Yet, his patience and faithfulness did not waver. Eventually, God's timing revealed its purpose when Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, leading to his elevation as the second in command in Egypt. This position allowed him to save many lives during a famine, including those of his own family. Joseph's journey highlights that God's delays are not denials, but part of His divine plan. His timing ensured that Joseph was prepared for the role he was destined to fulfill, and that the blessings were maximized. Another example is the story of Abraham and Sarah, who were promised by God that they would have a son, and become the parents of many nations. However, they were advanced in age, and the fulfillment of this promise took years. In Genesis 21:1-2, it is written, "Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him." This story reveals that God's promises are fulfilled according to his timing, not ours. The long wait allowed for a greater testimony of faith and the demonstration of God's power and faithfulness. The Apostle Paul's life also reflects the significance of trusting God's timing. Paul's mission to spread the gospel was filled with challenges, including imprisonment and numerous trials. Yet Paul trusted that God's timing was perfect. In Philippians 4:11-13, Paul writes about contentment and reliance on God. "I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength." Paul's ability to remain content and faithful despite difficult circumstances demonstrates his trust in God's timing and provision. These biblical examples teach us that embracing God's timing involves patience, faith, and trust in his divine plan. Hannah's answered prayer, Joseph's rise to power, Abraham and Sarah's promised child, and Paul's contentment through trials all reflect the truth that God's timing is perfect and purposeful. By trusting in God's schedule, we align ourselves with his plan and are better prepared to receive the blessings he has prepared for us. God's timing means recognizing that he orchestrates events according to his perfect plan. Ecclesiastes 3:1 assures us that there is a time for everything under heaven. By following the examples of Hannah, Joseph, Abraham, and Sarah, and Paul, we learn to trust in God's timing with patience and faith. As we do, we align ourselves with his divine plan and open ourselves to the fulfillment of his promises and the blessings he has in store for our lives. 7. Spiritual battle and perseverance. Facing obstacles and challenges is an inevitable part of life, but the Bible assures us that these difficulties are not without purpose. God's plan often includes overcoming obstacles to refine our faith and prepare us for greater blessings. Psalm 34:19 states, "The righteous person may have many troubles, but the Lord delivers him from them all." This verse emphasizes that while we may encounter difficulties, God is always present to guide us through and ultimately deliver us from them. One poignant example of overcoming obstacles is the story of Job. Job was a man of great faith who experienced severe trials, including the loss of his wealth, health, and family. Despite his suffering, Job never lost faith in God. Job 1:21 reflects his profound trust. "The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." Job's perseverance through unimaginable hardships ultimately led to his restoration and an even greater blessing from God. His story illustrates that obstacles, while painful, can lead to a deeper trust in God and a greater understanding of his plan. Similarly, the life of Joseph in the Old Testament highlights how overcoming obstacles can lead to the fulfillment of God's promises. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, falsely accused of a crime, and imprisoned. Yet throughout these trials, Joseph remained faithful and trusted in God's plan. His ability to interpret Pharaoh's dreams while in prison led to his promotion to a position of power in Egypt. From this position, Joseph was able to save many lives during a famine, including those of his own family. Genesis 50:20 captures the essence of Joseph's perspective. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Joseph's journey demonstrates that obstacles are often part of God's plan to bring about a greater good. The Apostle Paul's experiences also provide insight into overcoming obstacles through faith. Paul faced numerous trials, including beatings, imprisonments, and shipwrecks. Despite these challenges, he continued to preach the gospel and trust in God's plan. In 2 Corinthians 4-8-9, Paul writes, "We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed." Paul's resilience amidst adversity illustrates that obstacles can be opportunities for God's strength and grace to be revealed. His faithfulness through these trials ultimately advanced the spread of the gospel and strengthened the early Christian church. Another powerful example is the story of the Israelites' conquest of Jericho. After years of wandering in the desert, the Israelites faced the formidable city of Jericho. God instructed Joshua to march around the city for 7 days, with the walls falling on the 7th day. Joshua 6:20 describes the outcome. "When the trumpet sounded, the army shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged straight in, and they took the city." This miraculous event demonstrates that God's plan includes overcoming seemingly insurmountable obstacles through faith and obedience. These biblical stories highlight that obstacles are a part of God's plan and can lead to significant blessings and growth. Job's unwavering faith through suffering, Joseph's rise to power despite betrayal, Paul's perseverance amidst trials, and the Israelites' victory over Jericho all reflect how overcoming obstacles is integral to fulfilling God's promises. Trusting in God's plan means recognizing that obstacles are not setbacks, but opportunities for growth and divine intervention. Psalm 34:19 assures us that while we may face many troubles, God is always with us to deliver us from them. By following the examples of Job, Joseph, Paul, and the Israelites, we learn to trust in God's plan through difficulties and see obstacles as part of a larger purpose. As we persevere and remain faithful, we align ourselves with God's greater plan and open ourselves to the blessings and fulfillment He has in store. 8. God's provision. The Bible assures us that these trials are not in vain, but are part of God's greater plan to bring about victory and fulfillment. Romans 8:28 reminds us, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." This verse underscores that even in the midst of challenges, God is working towards our ultimate good and victory. A profound illustration of persevering through trials is found in the story of Moses and the Israelites. After leading the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, Moses faced the daunting task of guiding them through the wilderness. Despite their frequent complaints and lack of faith, Moses remained steadfast in his leadership. In Exodus 14:13-14, when the Israelites were trapped between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army, Moses encouraged them, saying, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." God miraculously parted the Red Sea, allowing the Israelites to escape and defeating their enemies. This victory came after a period of intense trial and uncertainty, demonstrating that perseverance through difficulties can lead to remarkable deliverance and fulfillment of God's promises. The story of Joseph in Genesis also highlights the theme of perseverance leading to victory. After being sold into slavery by his brothers and wrongfully imprisoned, Joseph maintained his integrity and faith in God. His unwavering trust was rewarded when he interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, leading to his elevation to a position of power in Egypt. Genesis 50:20 captures the essence of Joseph's perspective. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Joseph's journey from a pit to the palace illustrates that enduring trials with faith can lead to a greater purpose and ultimate victory. Similarly, the Apostle Paul's life exemplifies perseverance through trials. Paul faced numerous hardships, including beatings, imprisonment, and shipwrecks, yet he continued to preach the gospel with determination. In 2 Corinthians 4-8-9, Paul writes, "We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed." Paul's perseverance through these trials led to the spread of Christianity and the strengthening of the early church. His life demonstrates that enduring trials with faith can result in significant spiritual victories and the advancement of God's kingdom. The story of Job also serves as a powerful example of perseverance leading to victory. Job endured severe losses and suffering, including the death of his children and the loss of his health and wealth. Despite his trials, Job remained faithful to God. In Job 42:10, it is written, "After Job had prayed for his friends, the Lord restored his fortunes and gave him twice as much as he had before." Job's perseverance through intense suffering led to a restoration of his blessings and an even greater understanding of God's faithfulness. These biblical accounts illustrate that persevering through trials is a crucial aspect of the Christian journey. Moses' leadership, Joseph's rise to power, Paul's ministry, and Job's restoration all demonstrate that faithfulness through adversity leads to victory and the fulfillment of God's promises. Romans 8:28 assures us that God is working all things for our good, even when we face challenges. 9. Prayer and faith. Prayer and perseverance are fundamental aspects of a strong Christian faith. The Bible emphasizes the importance of persistent prayer and unwavering faith in God's plan, assuring us that these practices are vital in overcoming challenges and achieving spiritual victories. James 5:16 tells us, "The prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective." This verse underscores the significance of prayer in invoking God's intervention and blessings in our lives. One of the most compelling examples of the power of prayer and perseverance is found in the story of Hannah, as recorded in 1 Samuel. Hannah was deeply distressed because she was unable to have children, and her situation was compounded by the ridicule of her rival, Peninnah. Despite her sorrow, Hannah persisted in prayer, seeking God's intervention with unwavering faith. In 1 Samuel 1:10-11, it is written, "In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow, saying, 'Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life.' God heard Hannah's persistent prayers, and she gave birth to Samuel, who became a significant prophet in Israel. Hannah's story highlights that persistent prayer and faith can lead to profound blessings and the fulfillment of God's promises. Another example is the life of the Apostle Paul. Despite facing numerous hardships, including imprisonment, beatings, and shipwrecks, Paul remained steadfast in his faith and continued to pray and preach the gospel. In Philippians 4-6, Paul advises, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God." Paul's example demonstrates that through persistent prayer and gratitude, one can navigate even the most challenging circumstances. His unwavering faith and perseverance contributed to the spread of Christianity and the strengthening of the early church. The story of Elijah and the drought in 1 Kings 18 also underscores the power of persistent prayer. During a time of severe drought in Israel, Elijah prayed earnestly for rain. Despite initial signs of no change, Elijah continued to pray and trust in God's promise. In 1 Kings 18:41, Elijah tells King Ahab, "Go, eat, and drink, for there is the sound of a heavy rain." After fervent prayer, God answered Elijah's prayers by sending a heavy rain, ending the drought. This story illustrates that persistent prayer, even in the face of seemingly unchanging circumstances, can lead to divine intervention and the fulfillment of God's promises. The parable of the persistent widow in Luke 18 further illustrates the importance of perseverance in prayer. Jesus tells the story of a widow who continually approached an unjust judge for justice. Despite being initially ignored, the widow's persistence eventually led the judge to grant her request. Luke 18:7-8 states, "And will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones, who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice, and quickly." This parable teaches that God values persistent prayer and will respond to the faithful cries of his people. These biblical accounts emphasize that prayer and perseverance are integral to overcoming challenges and realizing God's promises. Hannah's faithful prayers, Paul's steadfastness, Elijah's persistence, and the widow's perseverance all demonstrate that continuous prayer and unwavering trust in God's plan lead to divine intervention and fulfillment of promises. 10. Final encouragement. God's timing is often different from our own, and learning to trust in it can lead to profound spiritual growth and blessings. Ecclesiastes 3:1 reminds us, "There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens." This verse emphasizes that everything unfolds according to God's perfect timing and plan. One of the most poignant examples of divine timing is the story of Abraham and Sarah. In Genesis 17, God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, despite his advanced age and the fact that Sarah was barren. The promise seemed impossible given their circumstances, yet Abraham and Sarah had to wait many years for the fulfillment of this promise. Genesis 21:1-2 says, "Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him." This story highlights that God's promises are fulfilled in his perfect timing, and what may seem impossible to us is possible for God. Similarly, the story of Joseph in the Old Testament illustrates the concept of divine timing. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers and wrongfully imprisoned. Throughout these trials, Joseph remained faithful and patient. His interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams eventually led to his rise to a position of power in Egypt, where he was able to save many lives during a famine. Genesis 45:7-8 reflects the fulfillment of God's timing. "But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God." Joseph's journey from betrayal to leadership underscores that God's plan unfolds in his perfect timing, and our faithfulness during waiting periods is essential for experiencing his promises. The life of the Apostle Paul also offers valuable insight into divine timing. Paul faced numerous trials and delays in his ministry, including imprisonment and shipwrecks. Despite these setbacks, he continued to trust in God's timing. In 2 Corinthians 12:9, Paul writes, "But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness.' Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. Paul's experience demonstrates that God's timing involves periods of weakness and difficulty, during which His grace and power are most evident. The story of Jesus' raising of Lazarus from the dead further illustrates the concept of divine timing. When Lazarus fell ill, Jesus did not immediately go to him. Instead, He waited until Lazarus had died, which seemed like a delay to those who loved Him. In John 11:4, Jesus explains, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Jesus' timing in raising Lazarus from the dead was designed to bring greater glory to God and demonstrate His power over death. This event highlights that what may appear as a delay is often a part of God's plan to reveal His glory and power. These biblical examples, Abraham and Sarah's waiting for Isaac, Joseph's journey from slavery to leadership, Paul's perseverance in ministry, and Jesus' timing in raising Lazarus, demonstrate that trusting in God's divine timing is essential for experiencing His promises and blessings. Each story underscores that God's timing is perfect, and what we perceive as delays or obstacles are often opportunities for God to demonstrate His power and fulfill His promises in extraordinary ways. Embracing the concept of divine timing involves trusting that God's plans are always unfolding according to His perfect schedule. The stories of Abraham, Joseph, Paul, and Jesus' miracles teach us that God's timing is integral to the fulfillment of His promises and the realization of His plans. By remaining faithful and patient, we align ourselves with God's divine purpose and open ourselves to experiencing His blessings and miracles in our lives. Understanding and embracing God's perfect timing strengthens our faith and reveals His blessings. By trusting in His divine schedule, we align with His plan and witness His promises fulfilled in extraordinary ways. Please like this video so God will always be with you.